We move on now to the cooling fan, clutch and engine installation. One of the plagues of 90s traditionally in the past has been balancing the fan and also measuring the run out with a dial gauge. Now there's nothing in Kasamo's instructions about doing this, but I thought just for fun we'd mount up the fan. This is this beautiful piece of billet engineering. Give you a close look for those who haven't had a look in the fan. There you go. Every one of those vanes is an aerofoil section and it's nicely polished up. This is a propeller balancer that's just been modified with a flybar and a couple of flybar collars, and we can spin that round, and usually you get a fairly evident heavy spot, and then you can drill out any heavy bits, but there is a slightly heavy focus on here. I've marked one spot and it does tend to go in that half, but it's very, very mild indeed. So that's two holes I've drilled out just to make it a bit lighter on the heavy side. And that's what it's like when it's fully ballast. When it stops, there's no recursive movement and there's no particular place that it stops, and the two holes that we drilled in this bit here stop on top. So I reckon that's about as perfectly balanced as you can get. But it's just very much the icing on the cake. I'm going to try a trial mating up of the, we seem to have picked up a rodent, that's for Cappy, who suggested some rodent element in the build videos. Now a trial mate up of the motor. This is the Align incarnation of the OS, this is the 91H, with the cooling fans on the back, and the bottom line is that they will only just, in fact they won't quite mate up, those fans get in the road of the back centre mounting plate there, so you're going to have to take this off. There's no big deal anyway, it's probably cosmetic. Just take the 4 crankcase cover bolts out and discard it. We're going to put a sensor for the Spectrum AR7100R in there anyway, so this has got to go. The instruction booklet shows mounting the engine first and then mounting the clutch assembly, which you can see here, the fan, clutch and pinion. But I'm not going to do that because you really do need to lock the engine to be able to tighten up these various assemblies properly. And short of sticking a toothbrush down the carburetor inlet or something down the exhaust, both of which don't come recommended at all, the only real way to do it properly is with a crankcase lock in the back case, for which case you're going to need it off the engine mount. So we'll put the engine mount assembly to one side first of all, take the back off, put our crankcase locking tool down in there, and then we can go and show you how we assemble the clutch together. First off, we're going to mount the 12-tooth pinion onto the clutch bell. These are really fine threads. It's dead easy to get it one thread out of sync and cross strip the thread, which is a major pain in the neck. So it's quite useful to use the starter shaft as a sort of a former, because the 12mm shoulder fits inside the clutch bell, and then the other shaft, the thinner shaft, looks like about 8mm, can then be used to guide the pinion on down, and then you can start to get the thread in the clutch bell. Now this was quite stiff. I was a bit worried I was cross stripping the thread, but it would not easily thread in first time round, so I had to get some gland nut forceps to hold it down and then push it down. I'd never ever put bare metal onto bare metal, because you'll just burr these pinions, the teeth on here, and that'll then make good sort of mating up with your main gear just about impossible. So put a leather belt round there, or put a tea towel or something around there, and once you've wrapped it around a few times, you can safely, paper tissue is not the ideal really, a paper towel's better, but once you've done that you can safely screw that down home. We've also got holes here for your magnets for the governor. Thoughtful touch is drilling that hole in the bottom to let the air out, and that saves the magnets from popping out from hydraulic pressure. That's the pinion screwed all the way down. It's got to go down so that the teeth butt onto the top of the clutch, and you should be able to see the steel butting onto the bottom of the aluminium holding there. This was really very hard to screw down. I had to use my clutch holding tool, which I made up a while ago for various headers, and it's just a couple of M4 bolts that can basically go into the holes on the clutch bell and move it around while we're screwing down. But that was very tight to do, and I really would like to see that run down a lot easier. I find it very scary because I have had problems stripping them and not getting them down square in the past. But just to check now, that slides down. That's obviously on nice and square, so we can relax with that. And I red Loctited that thread as well. First off, crankcase cover bolts out. Discard the bling, can't see us needing that again. Crankcase cover off. Nice new Virgin mechanics in there. And pop our crankcase locker in there. Okay, we've got our crankshaft locked down the back there, so the shaft is all locked up. Now, in order of assembly, we have a 1mm nut washer first of all. This is just for the OS, apparently not needed for the YS, but this is an OS motor. Now that's the prop washer that came with the engine. I noticed they do supply you one there, just in case you don't have one, if you've lost it. But the manual clearly says one washer, a 1mm one, which this one is. So we're not going to put any more on there, we'll have a trial assembly. Next goes your fan with the vanes heading up, and this should be a slide fit down onto the crankshaft. Now I'm just going to gently pinch up these M3 washers on there. I'm not going to tighten them up too much. The idea here being is that if we put the starter shaft on there now, screw it down, it'll compress this hopefully flat against and square to the main shaft, and then we can do these pinch bolts up in the main fan. So on goes the red Loctite again. Don't need to put it on, don't need to soak it in it. On goes our shaft. This is a right hand thread, so it tightens up clockwise. This is why when you put your starter on that tries to whiz it around anti-clockwise, it does tend to undo, and that's why I use red Loctite. You need an 8mm spanner on here. Don't go grabbing the fan, because you might bend it or break it. And then reasonably tough on there. If you use a good spanner, then you won't be able to apply more hand force on there than the thread can take. And that's about as tight as I can do it without snapping a gasket myself. Okay, now that's done up tight, we can tighten up evenly, a little bit of time, tighten up these M3 pinch. Okay, clutch goes on, recesses for the bolts. Oops, there's two M4 and two M3 8mm bolts that go down here. So that's the way that it goes down. Recess at the bottom, slips down, buttonholes at the top. Line it up with the M4 bolts and the M3 bolts, 4 in all down there, and blue Loctite are bolts down. Now there's a bit of an interference fan of this clutch on the fan hub, so doing up the bolts in a crisscross even manner just gently draws it down onto that. So don't go tightening up one of these bolts too much before, otherwise you're going to get it off square and start binding. Okay, now we've got our clutch on, we can pop our O-ring down. Now everything's gone right there. You should notice that the bottom of the clutch here, it lies actually on the fan hub, is butted up against that, and there shouldn't be any longitudinal play in the shaft at all. Kasama describes a slightly different way of doing it in the manual, by basically adjusting the clamp bolts on the fan until there's no play, but I seem to have got the same end point by doing it my way, which was a little bit simpler. But have a look over the page on the clutch assembly if you want to find out how the manual recommends it. So that's nice. One of the features of the Kasama design is to have the clutch very low down, as near to the engine as possible to reduce vibration and also keep the C of G all well in within the motor. See, there's no nut or pinch bolts or grub screws to retain the clutch down on the shaft. This will all be taken care of by the clutch bearing block, which we put on the frame and can adjust some of the end float and backlash in the clutch system. Alright, we put our crankcase cover back on. We put our AR7100R sensor down the back, discarded the little self tapper in favour of a M2 nut and nylock, discarded the Spectrum plastic support bracket, which is going to fail sooner or later, in favour of one of these nice blinged CNC varieties. Does it fit in okay? Yes, the quick answer is yes, it does. Nice snug fit in there, beautifully tailor-made for that. Doesn't seem to be any interference from the Spectrum bracket. The only thing that is a little bit close is that with the thickness of the bracket down here, the crankcase bolt is just butting up against this main frame down in here. Anyway, we'll secure the engine on there now with the M4 bolts supplied. That's the engine in mounted securely, everything snug down tightly with no gaps, and that's nice and square and vertical to the engine mount, and that's a very solid rugged assembly. And the clutch we can just pop on top of that for safekeeping. And that's the finished assembly, being checked with a dial gauge for run out. It's a little bit more than I like. It's about 0.12 of a millimetre, which is around about 5 thou. Ideally it should be 1 to 2 thou, but short of disassembling it all and rotating it round, there's not much I can do about that now. You can't really tap this fan on the mounting, so I think I'm just going to leave it like that for the time being and see how it goes, and if there's a lot of vibration the whole thing's going to come out, and then I'll spend a good amount of time trying to dial it out. So that completes our clutch and engine assembly. Next up we assemble the fuel tank and start putting together the main frames.